All right, let's go. Number 10. The Assyrian Empire's terror machine. The most disturbing thing about Assyrian violence is that it was not hidden in shame. It was announced. It was carved into palace walls, written into royal inscriptions, and turned into a language every enemy city was supposed to understand. The empire did not only want people to know it had won, it wanted them to imagine what resistance would cost before the army even arrived. That is what makes Assyria different from a simple story of ancient cruelty. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was one of the most powerful military machines of the ancient Near East, and its kings understood fear as a tool of government. Armies could not stand inside every city forever. Officials could not personally watch every province every day. So, terror became a message sent ahead of the army. A rebellious city was not just a military target, and it was a warning board. When Assyrian records describe siege warfare, deportations, tribute, captured rulers, and public punishment, they are not only describing damage, they are describing a system of control. The violence was meant to travel farther than the soldiers. A city that saw what happened to another city might decide that surrender was cheaper than pride. The palace reliefs make this even colder. They show siege ramps, battering rams, archers, prisoners, burning towns, and long lines of people forced from home. The images were not made for neutral history. They were royal propaganda. They told visitors that the king protected order by crushing anyone who challenged it. In that world, horror became part of state branding. The mechanism was brutally practical. An empire this large needed obedience over distance. Roads, messengers, governors, tribute systems, and military campaigns all mattered, but fear made them work faster. If people believed revolt would bring not just defeat, but public ruin, then many conflicts could be won before they became battles. This is why the Assyrian case still feels so uncomfortable. The horror was not random rage. It was organized communication. The empire turned suffering into policy, policy into image, and image into memory. It made terror visible so that future enemies would discipline themselves. Modern history books often reduce this to, the Assyrians were brutal. But that is too simple. The darker truth is sharper. Assyrian power was not only built on weapons, it was built on understanding how fear moves through human networks. A wall relief could keep speaking long after the battlefield went silent. Number 9. Rome's decimation punishment. Rome did not become terrifying only because its legions defeated enemies. Sometimes the fear came from inside the legion itself. One of the harshest Roman punishments was designed to make soldiers understand that failure could turn their own unit against them. Decimation was a collective punishment used in extreme cases, especially when a unit was accused of cowardice, mutiny, or disgraceful failure. The exact use changed across Roman history, and it was not an everyday practice. That is part of why it is so chilling. It was rare enough to feel exceptional, but famous enough to reveal what Roman discipline could become when commanders wanted to send a message no soldier would forget. The horror of decimation was not only the death sentence, it was the destruction of trust inside the group. And a military unit survives because men stand beside one another, sleep near one another, march together, and depend on the same shield line. Decimation attacked that bond directly. It told the unit that the group could be punished as a group, and that survival depended on controlling the behavior of the men around you. This was discipline turned inward. Rome understood that an army is not just weapons and training, it is expectation. If one soldier breaks, others may break. If one group runs, another group may wonder why it should stand. Collective punishment tried to make fear flow backward through the ranks before panic could flow forward. It made loyalty feel less like trust and more like surveillance. That does not mean every Roman commander used it often or casually. Many armies need morale as much as fear. A force that is terrified of its commander can become brittle. But the fact that decimation existed as a remembered option shows how far Rome could push the idea that the soldier belonged to the state before he belonged to himself. The punishment also tells us something about Roman power that triumphal arches do not. Rome liked to present victory as order, courage, law, and destiny. But order sometimes rested on methods that were meant to break people psychologically. The legion was disciplined, but discipline had a shadow. Behind the clean lines of formation was the possibility that the unit itself could become the courtroom. This is why decimation belongs in a list of ancient horrors, even though it was not a siege, massacre, or city destroyed. It shows a different kind of brutality, the state reaching into the bonds between comrades and using those bonds as leverage. The enemy outside the camp was not the only thing a Roman soldier had to fear, and that is what makes the case so hard to look at directly. Rome's military greatness is usually told through roads, armor, tactics, engineering, and conquest. Decimation reminds us that an empire can also be built by teaching its own men that shame, fear, and survival may one day stand in the same line. Number 8, Carthage after the Third Punic War. The horror of Carthage was not only that a city lost a war. Cities lost wars all the time in the ancient world. The horror was that Rome reached a point where victory no longer seemed enough. Carthage had to stop being a rival, stop being a center of power, and stop haunting Roman strategy from across the sea. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Carthage was no longer the empire that had once sent Hannibal across the Alps. Its navy was gone, its independence was limited, and Rome controlled the terms around it. But memory can be more dangerous than present strength. To many Romans, Carthage was not just a weakened city, it was the name of a fear that had almost broken them. That is what makes the Third Punic War so cold. The conflict did not begin because Carthage was about to conquer Rome, and it grew from a long atmosphere of suspicion, pressure, and political insistence that Carthage could never be safe as long as it existed. When Rome finally besieged the city, the target was not only an army, it was an urban world. Walls, harbor, temples, workshops, homes, stored food, and the identity of a people. Ancient sieges were not clean military contests. They attacked the system that kept a city alive. Supplies ran down. Leadership fractured. Families crowded into shrinking space. Every day made the next day worse. The walls did not just protect people. They also trapped them inside the consequences of a war they could no longer control. When Carthage finally fell in 146 BCE, the destruction became one of the great warning stories of the Mediterranean. Ancient sources describe the city ruined, survivors enslaved, and Roman power made unmistakable. The popular claim that Romans salted the earth is much less secure and is usually treated with caution. But the deeper point does not need that legend. Rome did not have to poison the soil for the message to be clear. The message was strategic annihilation. Carthage was not merely defeated in battle, it was removed as a political possibility. Its harbor no longer threatened Roman trade. Its name no longer belonged to an independent power. Its destruction told other cities that Rome could punish not just armies, but futures. This is why Carthage still feels brutal, even without exaggeration. The frightening part is not a single scene. It is the decision that an entire city could be turned into an example. Rome had learned from fear, and then it used fear as policy. And the enemy that once terrified Rome became proof of what Rome was willing to do when it decided memory itself had become dangerous. Number 7, the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Some ancient horrors did not end when the walls fell. They kept living inside religion, exile, memory, and identity. That is why the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE cannot be understood as only a military event. It was the breaking of a city whose meaning reached far beyond stone streets and defensive walls. The revolt against Rome had already turned Judea into a battlefield. Jerusalem became the center of resistance, factional pressure, sacred hope, and imperial response. When Roman forces under Titus closed around the city, the siege attacked more than soldiers. It attacked food, water, movement, civic order, and the ability of people inside to imagine a normal tomorrow. As siege warfare works by turning time into a weapon. An army outside can wait if it controls the ring around the city. People inside cannot wait forever. Grain disappears. Crowds strain every narrow space. Political arguments become survival arguments. The city becomes a pressure chamber, and every choice made before the siege begins to matter more than anyone expected. Jerusalem made that pressure heavier because it was not only a strategic location. It was the home of the Second Temple, the center of Jewish worship and identity. When the temple was destroyed, the loss was not simply architectural. It struck the religious and social structure that gave meaning to the city. A building can fall in a day. The memory of that fall can last for centuries. For Rome, the destruction served imperial logic. Rebellion had to be punished publicly enough to restore fear of Roman authority, and the empire could tolerate local customs, elites, and religious practices when they fit within obedience. But open revolt against Roman power invited a different kind of lesson. Jerusalem became a demonstration that sacred status would not protect a city from imperial force. The human cost was immense, but the script should not need graphic detail to make that clear. The real horror was systemic. War compressed people into a besieged city. Factional conflict weakened unity. Roman military pressure tightened the circle. Then the destruction of the temple changed history from politics into memory. The event reshaped Jewish life, Roman triumph, and the way later generations understood loss. That is why this case is so heavy. Rome did not only defeat a revolt, it created a wound in time. And the stones of Jerusalem became part of a story about empire, faith, survival, and the cost of resistance when an imperial state decides to make an example out of a sacred city. History books can list the year, the commander, and the outcome. But that barely touches what made the siege terrifying. Jerusalem in 70 CE shows how ancient horror could move from battlefield to identity. A city can be rebuilt. A temple can be remembered. But once a community is forced to carry destruction as part of its history, the war is no longer only in the past. Number 6. Human sacrifice in the Shang Dynasty. Some ancient horrors are easy to misread because they do not look like battle. They appear inside tombs, pits, oracle bones, bronze vessels, and ritual spaces. In Shang China, power did not only speak through armies and palaces, it also spoke through the dead. The Shang Dynasty, centered in the Yellow River world during the 2nd millennium BCE, left one of the richest archaeological records in early China. At sites connected to royal power, especially around Anying, archaeologists have found evidence of large-scale ritual sacrifice and retainer burial. The remains are not background tragedy. They are part of the machinery of kingship. That is what makes this case so disturbing. The violence was not random. It was structured. Some victims were likely war captives. Others may have been people tied to elite households or ritual obligations. And in royal tombs and sacrificial pits, human bodies could become offerings, attendants, political symbols, or messages to ancestors. The boundary between religion and state power was not clean. It was fused. Oracle bones make the system feel even colder. Shang rulers used divination to ask about war, harvests, illness, weather, ancestors, and sacrifice. These inscriptions show a world where royal decisions were linked to invisible powers. The king was not just a military leader. He was a mediator between living society and ancestral authority. That gave violence a sacred frame. The mechanism is important. A ruler who can command labor controls work. A ruler who can command armies controls force. But a ruler who can command ritual death claims something deeper. That political order itself reaches beyond ordinary life. Sacrifice made hierarchy visible. And it showed who could ask, who could offer, who could be offered, and who stood close enough to power to decide the meaning of a human life. This case has to be treated carefully. These were real people, not props for shock. The point is understanding how early states could turn violence into ceremony, ceremony into legitimacy, and legitimacy into a structure that survived beyond one king. Modern history often remembers Shang China for bronze casting, oracle bones, chariots, and early writing. Those achievements are real. But the same world also shows how technical brilliance and ritual violence can exist side by side. A civilization can produce art, writing, and political order while building that order on practices modern viewers find almost impossible to absorb. Number 5. The Bronze Age collapse. And the Bronze Age collapse is terrifying because it does not begin with one monster, one plague, or one battle. It begins with a world that seems wealthy, literate, diplomatic, and powerful. Then, across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East in the Late Bronze Age, parts of that world start to fail. Palaces burned, trade networks broke, writing systems disappeared from some regions. Cities were abandoned. Royal courts that once exchanged letters, gifts, metals, and grain stopped functioning as stable centers of power. For ordinary people, this kind of collapse would not have felt like a neat historical transition. It would have felt like the rules of life being removed one by one. The danger was systemic. Bronze requires copper and tin was not always nearby. Palace economies needed scribes, storage, taxation, labor, farmers, specialists, and long-distance exchange. Armies needed food. Elites needed legitimacy. Cities needed supply routes. If several pressure points cracked together, the damage could travel through the whole network. That is why no single explanation is enough. Scholars debate the mix: drought, famine, internal revolt, earthquakes, warfare, migration, raiders, collapsing trade, and political fragility. The old story of one invading group destroying everything is too simple. The stronger version is more frightening. The system may have been so tightly connected that multiple shocks made each other worse. A drought can weaken harvests. Weak harvests can raise unrest. Unrest can make states spend more on defense. War can interrupt trade. Interrupted trade can damage bronze production. Lost bronze production can weaken armies and tools. Weakened states can lose authority. Once trust breaks, every shortage becomes political. Collapse is rarely one falling wall. It is many supports failing close together. This is ancient horror without one clear villain. That makes it harder to put in a textbook chapter, but easier to feel. Imagine living where scribes record grain, ships bring metal, kings send messages, and temples promise order. Then the ships slow down. The grain runs short. The roads become dangerous. The king cannot protect the countryside. The future stops looking like the past. Not every place collapsed in the same way, and not every society disappeared. Egypt survived in weakened form. Some regions reorganized. New states and cultures emerged from the wreckage. But for many centers of late Bronze Age power, the old system did not recover. Its fall opened space for the Iron Age, new kingdoms, new identities, and new kinds of warfare. Now that is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so brutal in a different way from a massacre or siege. It shows that horror can be slow, administrative, and economic. People do not need to understand the whole system to suffer when it fails. They only need to feel the empty storehouse, the broken root, the missing protection, and the silence where authority used to speak. Number 4. The children of ancient Carthage's Tophet. Few ancient sites are as uncomfortable as the Carthaginian Tophet, because even the question at the center of it is hard to hold. Were the children buried there, victims of sacrifice? Children who died naturally and were placed in a special cemetery? Or part of a ritual system modern people still do not fully know how to read? The horror is not only in one answer. It is in the fact that the evidence forces the question at all. The Tophet at Carthage contained urns, stone markers, inscriptions, and the cremated remains of very young children, sometimes alongside animals. Ancient Greek and Roman writers accused Carthaginians of child sacrifice, often linked to Baal Hammon and Tanit. For a long time, those accusations shaped how the site was understood. But enemy testimony is never neutral, and this is where the case becomes more difficult than a shock story. Some scholars argue that the archaeological evidence supports ritual sacrifice. They point to the concentration of remains, inscriptions, offerings, and the way the space seems separated from ordinary burial. Others argue that the Tophet may have served as a special cemetery for infants and very young children who died naturally in a world where child mortality was painfully high. That disagreement matters. If the script pretends the debate is settled when it is not, it turns history into theater. What makes the Tophet powerful for this video is exactly that tension. The site shows how hard it is to interpret ancient ritual. When the people who made it are gone, the written sources are hostile or limited, and modern emotions rush ahead of the evidence. Human remains do not explain themselves. Urns do not come with subtitles. A stone marker can preserve a name or dedication, but not every grief, belief, or decision behind it. The brutal part is that either interpretation still leads into a world modern viewers struggle to face. If sacrifice occurred, then Carthage included a ritual system where the youngest lives could be folded into religion, crisis, or political identity. If the site was mainly a burial ground, then it preserves another horror, a society living with the frequent death of children and building a sacred space around losses that no family could make ordinary. This is why the Tophet should not be treated like a cheap mystery. It is not there to prove that one ancient people were uniquely monstrous. It shows something broader. Religion, grief, propaganda, empire, and archaeology can collide in one place until certainty becomes dangerous. History books often avoid this kind of ambiguity because it is uncomfortable. The Tophet gives neither. It gives burned bone, stone markers, old accusations, modern debate, and the reminder that some ancient horrors are not only events. Sometimes they are questions we cannot answer without disturbing the dead. Number 3. The Scythian royal burials. Some ancient rulers did not enter death alone. On the Eurasian steppe, power could be buried under huge mounds, surrounded by gold, weapons, horses, attendants, ornaments, and the evidence of a hierarchy that followed the elite into the ground. The Scythians and related steppe societies are often remembered for speed, horse warfare, archery, and brilliant animal-style art, and their world was mobile. But that does not mean it was simple. The royal burial mound, or kurgan, could become a frozen statement of rank. A person who controlled people, animals, and wealth in life could have that control displayed after death. The horror here is not only that retainers or attendants may have died around elite graves, it is the idea that death did not dissolve social order. It preserved it. In some burial contexts across the steppe, archaeologists have found horses carefully arranged, weapons placed with the dead, rich ornaments, and human remains positioned in ways that suggest service, sacrifice, or forced inclusion in the funeral order. A kurgan was not just a grave, it was a political scene built underground. Every object had a message. Gold said status, weapons said power, horses said mobility and military identity, Eri identity. Attendants said that the ruler's importance extended beyond a single body. The burial turned inequality into landscape, a mound visible from far away. Modern people often admire Scythian gold, and there is good reason. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, but beauty can sit beside coercion. A golden object in a museum case may have come from a social world where power could claim people, horses, labor, and memory, even after death. The preservation of some steppe burials makes them feel especially close. Ice, permafrost, or sealed conditions can protect organic materials that normally vanish. Wood, leather, textiles, felt, hair, and horse gear. That survival gives us an unusually vivid window into ancient life, but it also makes the hierarchy harder to ignore. The richness of the burial is not only art, it is evidence of how much could be gathered around one death. The Scythian case belongs here because it shows a quieter kind of brutality. No city has to burn, no army has to storm a wall. The horror is built into social order itself. Who gets remembered richly, who is arranged around them, and whose life becomes part of another person's monument. That is why these graves are more than beautiful archaeology. They show that ancient power did not always stop at the edge of life. Sometimes it crossed into death and ordered the ground to keep obeying. Number 2, the Maya drought and abandoned cities. Not every ancient horror arrived with soldiers at the gate. Some arrived as a sky that would not open, reservoirs dropping lower each season, fields giving back less food, and rulers who could no longer make the world feel stable. For parts of the classic Maya lowlands, the fear was not one sudden ending. It was pressure that kept returning. The first thing to say clearly is that the Maya did not disappear. Millions of Maya people still live today. What changed in the 8th and 9th centuries? CE was the power of many major cities in the southern lowlands. Some centers lost population. Some monuments stopped being raised. Some political systems fractured. The people remained, but the city world around them changed. That distinction matters because the real horror is not a fake mystery about a vanished people. It is the collapse of confidence. Classic Maya cities depended on water management, farming, labor, trade, competition, ritual authority, and the belief that rulers could keep order between people, gods, ancestors, and landscape. When drought hit repeatedly, it did not attack only crops, it attacked legitimacy. A dry year can be survived. A bad harvest can be absorbed if storage, trade, and leadership work. But repeated droughts change the rules. Reservoirs shrink. Maize becomes less reliable. Families move. Rival cities fight over resources and prestige. Rulers who once displayed power through temples may look weaker when the rain does not come. The political system has to explain a sky it cannot control. Drought alone is too simple as an answer. And the stronger version is that climate stress pushed on a world already filled with competition, population pressure, warfare, and fragile authority. A city can look powerful until the system beneath it needs too much water, too much labor, and too much trust. When those supports crack together, stone monuments can remain standing while society reorganizes. The empty plaza is the image that stays, not because everyone vanished, but because a place built to display power no longer commanded the same life around it. The terror became ordinary. One more shortage, one more conflict, one more family leaving, one more ritual that did not change the weather. Number 1. The Plague of Athens. The Plague of Athens was horrifying because it struck a city that believed it had built a rational strategy for survival. Athens had walls, ships, money, allies, leaders, and a plan. And then disease entered the city and showed that a plan can become a trap. The outbreak began during the Peloponnesian War, around 430 BCE, when Athens was fighting Sparta and its allies. Pericles had urged people from the countryside to withdraw behind the long walls, protecting the population, while the Athenian navy kept the city supplied. On paper, it made sense. Avoid open battle with Sparta's land army, use walls and sea power, and let the enemy waste strength outside. But walls solve one problem by creating another. When rural people crowded into Athens, the city became more congested. Families, supplies, fear, and uncertainty compressed into limited space. The same walls that kept soldiers out helped keep sickness in. War had turned the city into a container, and disease exploited the container better than any army could. Ancient descriptions of the plague are severe, but the exact disease is still debated. The Athenians did not know the pathogen, the transmission, or the medical explanation. They only knew that people were falling ill, leaders were losing control, and customs were breaking under pressure. The horror was social, as much as biological. Epidemic disease does not only attack bodies, it attacks trust. It strains care for the sick. It tests burial customs, law, religion, morale, and the idea that sacrifice or reason will produce order. When people see the careful and the careless suffer alike, rules begin to feel fragile. Athens survived, but it was altered. Pericles himself died during the epidemic, and the city's confidence never returned in quite the same way. The war continued for years, but the plague exposed a weakness strategy had not accounted for. Human density can become dangerous when fear drives people into the same protected space. The Plague of Athens was not just an ancient disease story. It was a lesson in how systems fail when their strengths turn against them. Walls became crowding. Security became exposure. Strategy became vulnerability. A city built to resist an army discovered that not every enemy stands outside the gate. Across these ancient horrors, the pattern is not simply that the past was more violent or more fragile. Power often made people believe a system could hold. Empire, army, city, ritual, palace, reservoir, wall. Then, pressure found the weak point. Assyria turned fear into policy. Rome turned discipline inward. Carthage and Jerusalem showed what happens when a city becomes a message. Age. Shang sacrifice and Scythian burials show power reaching into bodies and graves. The Maya drought and the Athenian plague show something quieter. Even brilliant societies can be shaken when daily life stops working. History books often smooth these events into dates and outcomes. But the deeper story is not clean. Ancient horror was not always chaos. Often, it was order becoming cruel, sacred, brittle, or blind. And once that happens, the most frightening thing is not the moment a wall falls. It is realizing how long people had trusted the wall